This unit is about familiarizing with risk. I would start by looking at the overall pricing process. Let me see if the system responds. Yes, as you can see here, the risk and the pricing process has at its core a risk costing sub-process that you see here, and which is probably the part that interests most of us the most, because it's the part where actuaries are going to give to add value the most, because we analyze things quantitatively, and but you see that all around that are activities that have very much to do with interactions with the real world, and that are crucial, of course, for the determination of the final price, and that you need to be conversant with, to be aware, and also know how these things work. And today we're going to familiarize to start with the familiarization with the risk. That means that when a pricing exercise comes on your desk, you normally get some data to analyze, but there's so much around, and so much about the client, about the risk, which is not contained in the data, and that you need to know in order to be able not to miss important information. And say here, it's very, or in the book, it's very difficult to overemphasize the importance of this step. It's very easy to be naive about an analysis if you don't do this properly. Of course, at the beginning of one's career, they might not be even asked to do too much work on this familiarization process, but still you will need to ask the underwriter, whoever gives you the piece of work, all the important information around this risk, so that you may incorporate it in your analysis. This is very important, and there's a flip side to it, which is that it is also the part which is the least amenable to prescriptive rules, in the sense that I cannot give you an algorithm on how to carry out this task. I cannot give you a checklist of things that you have to check. And once you've done that, you are safe, and you know that you've done all that you can. Unfortunately, you are in the real world, and you don't know exactly what will be important until you start asking questions around and look at information which is publicly available. And so I will still give some lists of obvious things that you have to check, but as I said, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. It's just a few ideas on where to look for information, and also what you normally use to get this information. The key thing in doing all this is not to miss the elephant in the room. If you are, for example, pricing a liability portfolio, there are questions such as whether this is exposed to asbestos-related claims. This is very crucial for you, because this can have a very high financial impact. And this is just an example. Maybe another example is that there's been a very large claim in maybe your pricing offshore energy risks, and you need to know that there's been a big claim against BP in British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico, because that is sort of a game changer. It shows you what can happen in the world, how big how large is the amount of money that can be dispersed for some, for something like that, and that needs to be, it's all information that is relevant to you and needs to be somehow incorporated. This familiarization with the risk with the client, of course, it's quite different depending on whether you're considering commercialized insurance or reinsurance on the one hand, or on the other hand, you consider personalized insurance, because in commercialized insurance and reinsurance, normally the client is quite big, and so in an analysis, client-specific analysis is possible, and on the other hand, for personalized insurance, you will have maybe 1 million different risks on the book, 1 million different clients, and if you work for a personalized insurer, and therefore the approach is different. We'll say a bit more later on, but staying for now in the case of the commercial lines and reinsurance, it's true that the client is one, but you still have a portfolio of risks. For example, in employer's liability, you have a portfolio of employees, and these are the risks that your policy is exposed to. In the case of property insurance, the portfolio is the buildings that you have when there's more than one. When you have commercial motor insurance, then you have a fleet of vehicles. So you see that normally the risk that you are writing can be broken down into smaller units. So what do you have to ask? And you can ask, by the way, when you say ask, and this is an open, it is depending on the circumstances, and then I mean asking the underwriter, or asking the client directly, asking the broker. It really depends on the role you're fulfilling. The first question to ask, normally, if in a commercial lines context, is what business is the client in? So if you're doing professional indemnity insurance, it depends. Things change depending on whether you are considering a law firm or an engineering consultant or a food and drinks industry. These are completely different risks, and in the case of insurance, the client's business is of course insurance, but there are different types of insurance. There might be large insurance, small insurers, niche insurers. So that insurers would focus on a particular type of policy, like aviation. Therefore, you need to know that type of information. And now it is also important to consider what the point of view is that you are adopting. So if you're working for an underwriter needs to know what the client business is, because it will define what the risk is. And but for a broker, or in general a consultant, as we are here, it will be important not only because it allows you to price the risk, and but because if you as a broker are in a way you become an agent of the company that wants to buy insurance, and therefore they trust in you, and so that you can give them the best advice in order to buy insurance. And if you if you show that you don't know their business, you're in trouble. You, one thing that my experience working for brokers, one thing that clients really, really don't like is finding out that you have no clue what they're doing, what they are, and the details of their operations. It's a bit like with people, if you don't show that you know about them, they will not trust them. And companies can be touchy, almost as sometimes people are touchy. And I remember one broker getting into trouble for misspelling. They're actually missing a hyphen in the name of an important large corporation in email communication. They stopped wanting to talk to him, and this broker got in quite a bit of trouble. I'm not telling you what the corporation is for which the hyphen was missing, but I think you can imagine it yourself. Another thing that you need to know is where the client operates. This is very important, especially for liability. Well, it's important almost for everything. For property, it is important because you need to know the properties, where they are, to understand what type of perils they're exposed to. For liability, you need to know territory because you need to know what type of legal environment the company operates in. And of course, what I call here the main numbers. So what I mean by main numbers, I mean such things as the company's turnover, the payroll, the number of employees, everything that is related to their exposure. Even if you don't use them for pricing some of this information, it still gives you a feel for what company, for the type of company you have, that you are dealing with. It's very different to deal. Of course, employers liability for a company that has a huge workforce, because it's a very traditional company, or a high-tech startup that basically is born in the garage but has a huge turnover because they are selling a very successful app for mobile phones. Things you need to know about are changes in the risk profile over time. Even if you know roughly what the risk profile is, imagine a company that has, for example, for which you have to sell employees' liability, and it's got a certain mix of clerical and manual workers. You will need to know whether in the past the company had the same type of profile, or maybe they were more industrial before and now they are more service related, and therefore the employees' liability risk is changing so rapidly that it almost doesn't make sense to go too far back in looking at the loss experience. An important thing that I found that was very common, much more common than you would expect, is finding out about the mergers and acquisitions that the company has gone through. Because very often the loss experience comes from different types of operations that have been merged. So, and they have completely different risk profile. You need to know about whether they happened, when they happened, etc. Or maybe a part of the company has been sold, so certain types of risks are not existing anymore, and you don't want to count this risk, or maybe you don't want to assume that certain risks will not happen because you haven't seen losses in the past, because you are acquiring a new operation that has some of these risks. Of course, if there's been any recent large claims, maybe pending negotiation, maybe these claims haven't made it to the data set, to the claims data set yet. But you can find them in the news. Maybe you are insuring a large ferry company, and while you doing that, you have your data set up to a certain date, and you hear in the newspapers that one of the ferries has sunk. Well, that is the type of information that you can't avoid considering, despite the fact that it might not be part of the data that you have negotiated to have. So these are examples of things you might want to ask about your client specifically, but there are also industry-related considerations. That is, information that you have that are not client-specific, but they are common to all of the clients in a specific industry, like the oil industry. Okay, and such information is, for example, what is the market share of your client as part of the oil industry, if it's an oil client? What have been the top losses in the industry? Because your client might not have experienced them, but some other players may have, and you will need to know that in order to price things properly. You need to know what actually drives losses in the industry. If there have been any recent changes in the trends, maybe there are more catastrophes, maybe there's more liability claims against one particular type of industry. Think about pharmaceutical companies. And these are, when something big happens to one of them, that's relevant to the whole industry. And insurers react to all of this. A single big pharma claim can make capacity go away from the whole market instantly. And of course, how does the experience depend on external factors such as new regulations introduced for an industry? Think again on pharma industry. Think about new regulations introduced about clinical trials. So yeah, you have to know the industry. And I say here, what about reinsurance? Well, you can imagine what the differences are here. Many of these questions hold true even for reinsurance. The difference, of course, that the client is an insurer. I already said that at the beginning. The main locations and main numbers, well, and the numbers of the insurers. Importantly, the risk profile is, in a way, you are a level detached from the client, the real clients that are insured. So you have, to you, the risk for an insurer, the risk profile is the type of business that insurer is writing, and in what type of location it is writing, etc. So it's basically the same information, but it's one layer above. So where do you find all these things? Again, do not feel that this is an exhaustive list, but I'm just saying some of the common sources of knowledge. Certainly, these are sources of knowledge that you will have to check. At least some of these you will always have to check. Other might be on a case-by-case basis. But normally, for example, in insurance, in commercial lines insurance, when a client wants insurance, it prepares, normally through a broker, an insurance submission in which all the relevant information about the client is stated. And that will include claims data, exposure data, and a little bit of history of the risk. As you can expect, this is a biased source of information, because normally you will have, if it's prepared by a broker, you will try to depict the situation of the client as positively as possible, consistently, of course, with the truth of the matter and with not hiding material problems. When business is done honestly, as it normally is, this you can expect a biased view, but you have to expect that the relevant facts have been mentioned. But there are many ways in which this information can be distorted. For example, by including only 5 years of experience instead of 10. And maybe 6 years ago there was a big claim. And another source of information is financial statements of the client, the balance sheet, for example. And that tells you what the weak points of a client are. If it's short of money, if it has a lot of capital, etc. Maybe one thing I should mention here, it's in the book, so you should be able to see that, but the information that you are collecting is not only for pricing purposes, it's also sometimes, if you are in an advisory role, to be able to advise the client on what type of insurance it needs and how much of it. Okay, so looking at all this information is also giving you the chance of producing more business or helping the client more. Okay, so one good place where to find these financial statements, I think that I don't know if I put a problem here. Well, I think some of the questions at the end of a chapter are an invitation to look for this type of information yourself. But one good place where you could look for financial statements is in the investors section of the client's website. Apart from this, very important, conversations with the client, with the broker, with anyone, or with the underwriter, if you will, for an underwriter, that knows things about the client that may not be publicly available, or things that people put on paper. They will be able to give you a background, a context about things that you can find around. Of course, all clients' publicly available information. I've already mentioned the investor section of a client's website. Typically, now you'll find a lot of information already in the client's website. A visit to the client's website is absolutely compulsory once you get pricing exercise. You really want to know what this client is doing in length, and there's a quick way of getting a feel for it. Although, of course, you will not be looking there for confidential information. More generally, may be helpful to familiarize with industry publications, especially if you see a lot of clients of a certain type. If you're dealing a lot with oil companies or pharmaceutical companies, after a while you want to know what their problems are, and so you will find a lot of useful information in publications by the industry. Sometimes scientific journals are a very useful source of information. I don't know, just to give you a specific case, I remember doing some work on property, and specifically on exposure to hail, and I found it very useful to see publications about hailstorms in Europe, their frequency, their seriousness, and this is all information which is publicly available or can be purchased at reasonable prices, and it can be very, very helpful to see what to expect from a risk, especially when the specific experience of the client has not been sufficient from a statistical point of view, and everything else you can think is relevant. So this is the situation with commercial lines and insurance. As I mentioned before, the situation is a bit different for personal lines, because you can't deal with a specific client. You don't have a specific client that comes to your desk and asks you for a quote and for a pricing exercise. If there's in the electronic profession, there's no such thing as a GP that families go to, and you work as a family actuary. You always deal with large clients, and that's one of the reasons why you are forced or have the privilege to, depending on the point of view, of working in the largest cities in the world, because that's where the clients are to be found. And so in the case of personal lines, the situation is a bit different, but still, as in the case of commercial lines and insurance, you may not have you have a portfolio of risks. And for example, if you are insurance, motor insurance, you will have a portfolio of clients with cars, and you have to analyze the profile of this portfolio. Now, the reason why this is not so important, familiarizing the clients here, is actually it is even more important to analyze this portfolio as a portfolio. But normally the clients are so many that the analysis of the portfolio and the familiarization with the risk is actually the core analysis. So if you are insuring motor, what you will find is that most of your time is actually spent in analyzing the statistical characteristics of that portfolio and identifying the main risk factors of this portfolio and price each individual policy depending on the values of these risk factors. And this is something it is very important, and we're going to look at it later on. Let me quickly see what this is in the book. And so that's going to be one of the last lectures here, and it's in the book it's chapter 26 and 27. They deal with topics that are typically personal lines topics, and they're all about understanding your portfolio. So I haven't said much about personal lines here. It's not because familiarizing with your portfolio is not important here. It's that it is so important that it deserves a complete analysis on its own with very reasonably sophisticated statistical tools.